Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the Bee's Knees by the Big Cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 6, Day 3. But first, let's do our daily punishment. Why was the cookie sad? Because his mom was away for long. Wafer. All right, your key terms for today are the Underwood Tariff, the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Federal Reserve Bank, the third bus, the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, La Follette Siemens Act, the Central Powers, the Sussex Pledge, the Federal Farming Act, the Adamson Act, the Working Men's Compensation Act, the Lusitania, dollar diplomacy, moral diplomacy, and the Allied Powers, and MANIA. We're going to go over Wilson's policy towards banking, his policy towards corporations, his policy towards tariffs, his domestic policy. And we'll talk about his policy towards workers and laborers, and his foreign policy before World War I. We'll also talk about the World War I and how that impacted Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy. So in the election of 1912, if you remember, the Republicans split. Theodore Roosevelt formed a third party, the Progressive Party, and the Republican vote is going to split between him and Taft. The Democrats will run Woodrow Wilson. He's going to run under the campaign of New Freedom. He wants to get rid of the 3 walls of privilege. He wants to get rid of, do antitrust legislation to go against corporations, banking reform, and he wants tariff reduction. One of the policies of Theodore Roosevelt, even though he didn't win the election of 1912, his Progressive Party adopted a platform of new nationalism, and later on, especially under FDR, they will adopt some of these ideas. So some of the ideas of new nationalism were women's suffrage, social welfare, which FDR will adopt, minimum wage, consolidation of trusts, consolidation of labor unions, and more regulatory agencies in Washington, D.C. So one of the ironic things is the new nationalism platform of TR was actually more progressive or liberal than the New Freedom of the Democrats and Wilson. Here's a cartoon from the election of 1912. This is obviously TR. Let's talk about Woodrow Wilson. He was the former president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey. He was standoffish. He was an intellectual. He was known as cold and aloof. He loved humanity rather than the individuals. He was inflexible, stubborn, naive, idealistic. He was not pragmatic, and you need pragmatism in politics. He was also racist. As president, Woodrow Wilson, he's the first Southern president. He was born in Virginia. He's going to, Woodrow Wilson will play Birth of a Nation in his, in the White House. And the Birth of a Nation was a movie that was made that just kind of glorified the KKK. He also wrote introduction on one of the books that was about the KKK, talking like very positively about it. He also was the first president since Lincoln to resegregate the White House. So even though he's a progressive, progressive does not mean you're not racist. So Wilson's progressivism, he wants to assault the 3 walls of privilege: tariffs, banks, and trusts. First, he's going to go after tariffs. He's going to do the Underwood Tariff, which is going to reduce imports and fees. You remember Taft tried to do, he tried to lower the tariff also, but the tariff that Taft created was really not that much lower, the Payne-Aldrich tariff. The Underwood Tariff will be significantly lower. He's going to create the third national bank, the Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank, what it does is it issues reserve notes to other banks. It loans out money to other banks. It's the banker's bank. The Federal Reserve Bank is pretty interesting. It's not going to be a direct banking system. It will be kind of indirect. The Federal Reserve Bank has 12 governors, and they're appointed by the president. It also has 12 regional banks throughout the country. What the Federal Reserve really does is it means to control monetary policy. And monetary policy is like policy of the money. So it really is trying to control inflation and deflation. And it also can indirectly control unemployment. And it does this by controlling how much money is in circulation. So for example, some of the things the Federal Reserve can do is they could increase the interest rates So like if Bank of America wants to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, then the Federal Reserve could decide on how much they're going to charge. If the Federal Reserve does not want that many people borrowing money because they are afraid of inflation, they'll charge high interest rates. That means Bank of America will not borrow the money and there will be less money in circulation. That's going to cause deflation. Conversely, if there's high unemployment and the Federal Reserve wants banks to borrow money, it will lower interest rates. That way, banks will be more likely to borrow money. That's going to increase the money in circulation, which will cause inflation, but will also lead to less unemployment. Next, Wilson is going to create the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, in 1914. This was meant to end unlawful competition, false advertising, mislabeling, adulteration, and bribery. It could prosecute people for doing these illegal kind of things, corporations and corporate heads. People are still charged under the FTC even today. Lastly, the Clayton Antitrust Act was supposed to be a anti-monopoly. We already had the Sherman Antitrust Act, but if you remember, the Sherman Antitrust Act was used mostly against labor unions, and it wasn't very powerful. The Clayton Antitrust Act was specifically meant to be used against monopolies. It was meant to outlaw price discrimination and interlocking directories. Some of the big corporate heads, like John D. Rockefeller, had used interlocking directories. So this was meant to create a stronger antitrust law. Here's Wilson going after the triple walls of privilege right here. He's going after tariffs, trusts, banks. Some of the other things Wilson did, he's going to create the Federal Farm Act of 1916, which will provide low interest rate loans to farmers. He'll improve upon highway construction, money for state colleges. The Follett-Siemens Act of 1915 was meant to give better working conditions and better pay for U.S. seamen. The Workingmen's Compensation Act of 1916 is the beginning of workers' comp. So like if you get injured, you get time off, you still get paid. You can't just get injured and get fired anymore. Important law for labor. The Adamson Act of 1916 is going to offer the 8-hour workday. It will train workers and it provides overtime if they work 8 hours or more. The Adamson Act was for railroad workers, but eventually you'll start to see other companies have these same kind of laws where you have 8-hour workday, you get overtime as well. Here's a picture of an injured worker. Yay, workers' comp now. Let's talk about his foreign policy. Wilson hated Taft's dollar diplomacy, where like America was supporting American businesses. Wilson's foreign policy is going to be moral diplomacy. He wanted to base American foreign policy on morality and ethics. So in 1916, he gives the Philippines a territorial status. In 1917, he'll purchase the Virgin Islands from Denmark. He was kind of hypocritical. He will invade Haiti, which goes against the idea of moral diplomacy. When Haiti had an anti-American government, Wilson will send in the Marines. He'll also almost go to war with Mexico in 1917, which also kind of goes against moral diplomacy. Mexico was having a revolution from 1910 to 1920. America originally supported Pancho Villa. We're going to turn against Pancho Villa, and Pancho Villa makes it his life go to kill all the gringos. Pancho Villa actually invades New Mexico and kills like 19 American citizens. Wilson sent some soldiers into Mexico to try to find Pancho Villa, and it looked like America would have had a war with Mexico, but this is when World War I actually starts to happen, so it kind of prevents it from happening. All right, so in 1914, we're going to have World War I. And World War I is going to we're going to talk about it in a second. It's going to be between the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. The acronym of World War I is MANIA: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And I have some examples of all of those things right here of what caused World War I. Like in militarism, countries were getting larger armies. Alliances, you have the Allied powers and the Central Powers. Imperialism, Germany and France specifically are fighting over for parts of Africa. Nationalism, some parts of the Slavic area want independence from Austria-Hungary. Germany is very nationalistic. So, let's talk about World War I. The acronym for World War I is MANIA. You have militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. The two alliance systems in World War I will be the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and the Allied powers, France, Britain, Russia, Japan. This isn't how it was originally. Originally, Italy was allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but once World War I started, they became cowardly, and they decided to remain neutral, and then they joined the Allied side when they thought they were going to win. Also, the three original sides for the Allied powers were France, Britain, and Russia. Here's what causes World War I. The Prince of Austria-Hungary, the next in line of the throne, is going to be assassinated by a Serb. Serbia was a country. They wanted part of Austria-Hungary to create a larger Serbia. The Prince of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, was willing to give Serbia to give the Bosnia area some independence. So he's actually a friend of them. But a terrorist group, the Black Hand, that was tied to the Serbian government, assassinates Franz Ferdinand. That's actually an act of war. Like, I don't care. That's an act of war. So Serbia is to blame. What's going to happen is Austria is going to demand that Serbia meets all these demands and basically gives up their sovereignty. Serbia is going to refuse. Austria-Hungary is going to go to war with Serbia. Serbia is allied with Russia. Russia is going to not only mobilize their army against Austria-Hungary, but also against Germany. Germany will declare war on Russia, and then France will put their army against, they'll mobilize their army against Germany, and then Germany will go to war against France, and then Germany, in order to attack France, they are going to march through this little neutral country right here, Belgium, to try to get through France, because there's a lot of soldiers right here. That's going to lead Britain declaring war on Germany. So it's this whole alliance system. It's not very good. At the beginning of the war, most Americans were anti-German due to it seeming that Germany attacked Belgium for no reason. And also, like when World War I started, the British cut the cable lines for the telegraph. So the Americans were getting all their information from the British and the French from their propaganda. America will loan $2.3 billion to the Allies, so we will have an interest in them winning. They'll trade heavily with the Allies. Germany could not trade with America due to geography. As soon as World War I starts, Germany is going to be blockaded by Britain. So Britain is going to use their ships to try to blockade and starve Germany. And Germany is going to have to, that's why they're going to start doing submarine warfare to try to sink British ships. Germany is going to announce submarine warfare in 1915 to try to stop the blockade. They said they would try to not sink neutral shipping, but when you're in a submarine, sometimes you hit ships that are not the ones you were intended. This, again, is another graphic organizer that shows the alliance system and just how kind of confusing it was. See, one of the things that makes it even more confusing, before World War I started, they actually had different names. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy were called the Triple Alliance. They'll change their name to the Central Powers, and Italy will leave. They'll deuce out. Russia, France, and Britain were called the Triple Entente, and they'll change their name to the Allied Powers. Really kind of confusing. Here's the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Both him and his wife died in this assassination attempt. So, in 1915, the Germans are going to sink a ship from Great Britain called the Lusitania. Okay, here's the thing. During a war, you probably shouldn't be riding in a ship of countries that are at war with each other. The Lusitania was supposed to be a passenger ship, but what the British were basically doing was they were using Americans as human shields, They figured the Germans wouldn't sink a ship that had Americans on it. So it was a passenger ship, but the British secretly put 4,200 pounds of ammunition in this ship. So it technically was a warship, so Germany was justified in attacking it. But this is going to outrage the Americans. You sunk a ship, you killed 128 American citizens. How dare you? Blah, blah, blah. And what's going to happen next is Germany will sink another ship, the Sussex. Wilson's going to issue the Sussex ultimatum, basically telling them that he would break off diplomatic relationships, which would have led to war, unless Germany stops with the submarine warfare. Germany will promise in the Sussex Pledge that they will stop. Germany promised that in the Sussex Pledge that they will stop unrestricted submarine warfare if there was no military contraband in the ships. Also, Germany kind of said in the Sussex Pledge that we'll stop this, but we also want you to get Britain to stop the blockade. America is going to ignore a big part of that, and they're going to just think that we got Germany to stop, everything is good, we could still remain neutral. Woohoo! So it does not look like we're going to go to war yet. We get to the election of 1916. TR is going to refuse to run again, so the Progressive Party dies. The Republicans will nominate Charles Evans Hughes. Wilson's slogan will be, "He kept us out of war." He will win a narrow victory in 1916. And part of the big platform of him winning the victory was that he kept us out of World War I, which he'll soon get us into. There's the Lusitania. All right, kiddos, that's all I have for you for today. Until next time, deuces, yeah.